Chair, I'm afraid we can't hear you.
Is it Councillor Mackenzie, or do you want officers, or are you going to ask your officers to introduce it?
I'm sorry, I had my sound on mute. Good evening, everyone. As you're all aware, fire safety has rightly moved to the top of the national agenda when it comes to safety for residential buildings. Hackney Council places its resident safety as the #1 priority as a residential landlord. It was one of the very first London boroughs to establish a dedicated team to lead on work on fire safety. This team undertakes all our fire risk assessments, commissioned work to address any concerns, and develops our response to the ever-changing regulatory world of fire safety. When considering where we were, I believe that we have been at the forefront of local authorities in responding to fire safety. We have not just sat back and waited to be told what to do. We have taken a comprehensive approach to reviewing our housing stock. And where fire safety issues have been highlighted, we've acted and continue to do so. We have completed work on Lincoln's Court, Bevin, to replace external wall insulation. We are currently working on site to replace external wall insulation at Seaton Point. And we have work planned for Fellows Court to replace internal cladding. Steve Waddington, the Strategic Director of Housing Services, and Mikhail Jafonski, Head of Resident Safety, are here tonight to present a prepared presentation. Mikhail will now take you through the core bits of legislation and activities we're currently working through. Over to you, Mikhail.
Thank you, Councillor Mackenzie. I just have a question. Does everyone see my presentation, or do I have to present it on the screen? Shall I present it on the screen, yeah?
Yes, if you can present, please.
Yeah, will do. Can everyone see that? Yep.
Yeah. Yes,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, good evening to all, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present to you an update on what the resident safety team have been leading on in the field of fire safety in housing. My name is Michał Jankowski, and I've been the head of resident safety team since October last year. So the resident safety team was established in 2018 to take over the responsibilities for leadership on various matters affecting safety of our residents, with the primary focus on residential buildings safety and compliance. So in order to cover all aspects of property safety, we have specialists split within the resident safety team. And the team, as illustrated on my presentation, covers the three main areas, and those are fire safety, property risk and compliance, and asbestos management. Today's presentation main theme is fire safety, so I'll be focusing on that. So within the fire safety service, we predominantly focus on provision of fire safety, fire risk assessments in residential blocks of flats as defined by the legislation. We also branch out into other projects such as Resident Insight project, which helps us with understanding how our residents can be supported in case of emergency. And I will be talking about it later in my presentation. To assist us also in effective implementation of the fire risk assessment process, we also use tools such as our compliance database online, which is called SAFE. This database makes it possible for us and for residents to access copies of the most up-to-date fire risk assessments for the blocks via our website. So this means residents have access to the most up-to-date information at the click of a button. So just to give you a bit of context in respect to fire safety and our work in terms of legislation that currently applies to us. So the primary piece of legislation that was introduced in 2005 is the Regulatory Reform Order, Fire Safety Order. And that piece of legislation was a kind of a fundamental change in how fire safety was managed up until that point. Up until 2005, fire brigade or fire service was responsible for fire safety, effectively issuing fire safety compliance certificates to landlords. And after 2005, this responsibility was then put on landlords to ensure residents are safe. So as a result of that, my team up until today are completing fire risk assessments on behalf of landlords. To enable us to do this effectively, additional guidance was implemented around 2009 and 2011. There was guidance around fire risk assessment and fire safety in purpose-built blocks of flats. And those two pieces of legislation were recently withdrawn as a result of phase 1 Grenfell Tower inquiry. So that means that currently, as it stands, the fire risk assessment process is in a transition period when it comes to legislation and guidance, and the old guidance have been withdrawn, and the new one is still yet to be published. So to bridge that gap, the government has published specific advice which stems from the Grenfell Tower inquiry recommendations, and we are in the process of implementing those recommendations so that we're fully compliant at the time when this becomes legislation. I will talk about the details, how we do that later on. So like Councillor Mackenzie said, we not only meet the minimum requirements, but we are also at the forefront of the future legislation. So when it comes to the actual fire risk assessment, I'll just give you a little bit of breakdown of what we have achieved in 2021. So when it comes to fire risk assessments, we follow the current kind of industry-wide approach, which is categorizing fire risk in regards to buildings into three main categories: high, medium, and low. But our medium risk category is further split into three types, which is the 36, 24, and 12, which refers to the timescales we give for review of those fire risk assessment. But this approach allows us to give more individualized approach to fire safety and to each of our properties, because we have such a wide-ranging portfolio of buildings in Hackney. And in 2021, we've completed a total of 252 fire risk assessments on site across all types of different housing buildings in Hackney. Majority of those assessments were rated as medium risk, with over 90% of buildings within this risk category. And there were 4 buildings which were scored as high risk and 9 which scored low. In terms of the breakdown of actions picked up from the fire risk assessment, we raised a total of 357 high risk actions in 2021, and almost 73% of those have been completed to date. And those actions are completed without any delays, and may include things like replacement of fire doors, works to improve compartmentation, and fire safety detection systems. 16% of high-risk actions have been identified in 2021 are currently in progress. And then this means that actual works could have been completed on site, but we're still waiting certification from contractors. And the remainder of the works have been added to the future program, which means those are implemented and delivered as part of wider fire safety works through our major works contractors in property and asset management. In terms of medium risk actions, in 2021, we have identified over 3,500 medium risk actions and completed over half of those to date. The remaining half are either in future or future program or are in progress. Examples of medium risk actions include replacement of installation of signage, removal of combustible items in communal areas, or installation of premises information boxes. Like Councillor Mackenzie mentioned, we've also completed major fire safety works in Hackney. So just to give you a bit of an examples, at Lincoln Court, the 3 towers have been stripped of polystyrene insulation, and we replaced that insulation with mineral fiber, which is not only providing superior protection from fire spread externally, but also ensures our residents' homes are suitably insulated from heat loss. We have completed similar at 9 Bevan, and are currently in the process of completing a similar project at Seaton Point as we speak. And one major fire safety work project in the pipeline is at Fellows Court, which includes removal of cladding in the communal areas, replacement of glazing in communal doors, and improvement of ventilation across the communal sections of the corridors. And we are also in consultation with the national gas operator on the potential removal of gas from that building. We also get involved in other fire safety works, non-major fire safety works. Those include fire door replacements, fire alarm upgrades, dry riser installations. So just to give you a bit of a context, we've identified that, and earmarked over 3,700 doors to be replaced across our portfolio. We've successfully delivered 674 doors to date. That project has been affected quite badly by COVID-19 situation, supply chain delays and manufacturing delays, but we are getting back on top of that project. In terms of dry risers, for example, we've installed 284 dry risers across the stock. So that's a massive achievement. And also we have 4 buildings where we retrospectively installed sprinklers to further improve safety of our residents. We've completed thousands of fire stopping works to ensure that we can sustain stay put policy, which massively relies on passive fire protection levels to be suitable. We also developed and implemented a resident insight project, which is a response to the recommendations stemming from the Grenfell Tower inquiry. And that allows us to proactively identify residents within households where those residents might need assistance in terms of evacuation in case of emergency. And we're pioneers in this field, and we recently been contacted by Home Office to discuss the outcome of this project and share the learnings and the good practice examples. As a further step to allow us to share this information in regards to residents' evacuation requirements, we also installed premises information boxes across all of our high-rise and medium-rise buildings. And that information included in the boxes is not only helping fire brigade to identify households where assistance may be required, but also allows them to identify location of dry risers within the block. And the last one of the last recommendations from Grenfell Tower inquiry, which we already have completed, was the installation of wayfinding signage. That includes floor level indicators and floor menus, which again helps fire brigade to find a way in case of an emergency. In terms of ensuring quality of materials building materials that end up on our buildings in terms of fire safety, ensuring that there's a quality over cost approach. So in terms of that, we have various methods to ensure just that the standards are met and often exceeded. So firstly, with the new build process, we ensure that we have written design standards which specifically specify materials that should only be used when it comes to fire safety. For example, our specifications exclude use of particular items. So, for example, aluminium composite materials are not allowed to end up on our buildings. We also engage professional services to lead on the aspects through on these aspects of design, and also help us to deliver construction phases. And lastly, the Council Regeneration Team fully complies with the Royal Institute of British Architects Gateway process, which is based on a multi-team approach to design, project management, and construction of new homes. And my team, the resident safety team, is an active member of that Gateway process. When it comes to existing buildings, our property and asset management team follows the principles of the asset management strategy, which puts fire safety at the forefront of the works and priorities. This team also has specific guidelines set in place to ensure the latest developments in the field of fire safety are taken into consideration when materials are chosen for construction. And in addition, major works are delivered through design and build contract types. So additional design responsibilities are put on contractors to ensure only materials that comply with latest set of regulations are used. And finally, through the stringent procurement process, due diligence is given to the development of detailed contract specifications, and particular attention is given to fire safety element of the specifications. So not only we ensure that we have written specifications for design, but also we allow our contractors to properly bid for fire safety element of contracts, so that, there is there's full transparency for this process. One of the biggest challenges to the Council over the past 18 months has been the implementation of EWS1 survey, which were introduced in 2019 by mortgage providers. And the EWS1 form is not a pass or fail document. It is an advisory note by which the mortgage lender will form an opinion and decide ultimately whether they will lend or not on the property. It is likely that with a B2 rating on the survey, the mortgage application will be rejected until such time when either mitigation measures can be put in place or the works have been completed to satisfy the mortgage lender requirements. So the Hackney Council has made a commitment to provide leaseholders with EWS1 surveys on request and have introduced a flat fee of £750 per request to try to recoup some of the contractor and administrative costs, but this is just a drop in the ocean. Due to the lack of suitably qualified fire engineers, the unprecedented demand for EWS1 surveys means that currently it's taking a very long time. It's minimum of 16 weeks for each leaseholder to obtain EWS1 survey report, and in some cases it takes actually much longer because we need to arrange for intrusive surveys to be carried out. So as a response to the EWS1 surveys, we have developed a procedure to manage the results of those surveys, and all blocks that require remedial actions following a survey will be considered based on an overall fire safety risk, so that we can ensure that we can have a coordinated approach to our safety management works program. As a matter of course, we do review the fire risk assessment for every single block that receives B2 rating, and if any remedial actions are required, these are added to the major works program, and any urgent fire safety works are completed as a matter of priority. One such example of priority works carried out is Seaton Point, which is currently undergoing insulation replacement works. And in terms of the future challenges and legislation changes, so there are two major pieces of legislation being introduced, and these are the Fire Safety Act and the Building Safety Act. Both of these directly affect how we manage fire safety in Hackney. So firstly, the Fire Safety Act will require us to risk assess external fire spread in a similar fashion to the EWS1 process. We will have to take into account what is the impact of the building's facade on overall fire safety. It is now hoped that this process will replace the requirement for the EWS1 survey on at least buildings below 18 meters, but that's still kind of being discussed by the government and the mortgage lenders. Whereas the Building Safety Bill will require landlords to employ building safety managers and introduce the concept of the golden thread of information, which will fundamentally change the way we manage information in regards to our buildings. All building safety records will have to be digital and available both to the residents and submitted to the newly established regulator to obtain a license to operate the building. These rules will, at least initially, only apply to buildings over 7 stories or 18 meters, and we have already made great leaps by employing one building safety manager and implementing online compliance database SAFE, where we store all of our buildings compliance documents and fire risk assessment in a digital format online and available to our residents. So thank you for your time, and I welcome opportunity to answer any of your questions that you might have. Steve?
Yeah,
Mr.
Chair, can
Waddington?
yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to add onto what Michal has set out there, because I suppose just to place some of it in context, because I think when we were talking, Michal was talking about fire risk assessments and identified, I think it was over 3,000 recommendations on the medium risk. Actually, that as a single figure sounds a lot, but to place that in context, actually, as Michal said, some of this is, you know, damages to doors, damages to door closers, signs that need changing because legislation's been increased or changed. You know, one of the real challenges we have is maintaining a sterile environment within communal areas and communal staircases. So any piece of furniture that's left out or anything that's put out there actually impacts, and all of those add up, and that's where all of those numbers come from. So, you know, 3,000-4,000 on a stock of when you add in the leaseholders, you know, upwards of 30 just over 30,000 properties is not a large amount. It's not unexpected. So I just wanted to place that in context around that.
Thank you. I've got Steve Webster.
Hi, Mikhail. As for Mikhail and Steve, in view of the announcement from Michael Gove last week about the impact on leaseholders for the removal of cladding, so removal of cladding for buildings over 11 metres, there'll be no cost to leaseholders. Michael Gove expects that the developer or the private landlord will pay for that. My question is, will this also apply to council house, and so will that be applicable to council housing and leaseholders in buildings over 11 metres? The second question is in regard to EWS1s. If residents are living in blocks which are due to have further works, like you mentioned, fellow courts, the removal of cladding, or any works which will prevent an EWS1 being issued, will the residents, leaseholders who want to sell their property, will they, I take it they will have to wait until all the work is completed? Is that correct? So they could be waiting 2 years, 3 years in some cases.
Yeah, I'll pick those up, and Michal can come in with any detail. I think the announcement from Michael Gove was obviously that he expected developers to foot the bill. I think it's highly likely that the council would be classed as a developer because we have built properties and we've improved properties. What he put forward was a suggestion as to what he thought should happen, and if developers, not particularly focused on local authorities or housing associations, but major developers in the private sector, didn't do that, then it'd come forward with legislation that would in some way, for want of a better phrase, tax them to create a fund. Obviously, we need to consider that. It's one of the things that we now need to discuss with members, to actually look at what position the council wants to take within that. I think it's fair to say the council has taken quite a pragmatic approach in the work so far, and its approach to managing that with leaseholders, and I would expect the council to continue picking that up. With regards to EWS1s, as Michal said, they withdrew the guidance which Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors use, that recommends EWS1 forms for properties of 11 to 18 metres. And correct me if I'm wrong, Michal, I always get this number wrong. The recommendation was to move to past 9908, I think, whatever the number is, which is basically it's the principle that we use with fire risk assessments, that moves away from looking at an individual element, which is what an EWS1 form does, survey does, but to look at fire safety in a comprehensive and overall approach. It's who knows what RICS will do or how mortgage lenders will react to that. And obviously one of the things that Michal mentioned is we've got a process that actually sets out, obviously if we did an EWS1 form and it identified a B2 rating that was high risk, that procedure says we would do that immediately and in the current programme. If it's a medium to low risk, it would go into the next round of capital works on that property. Obviously, one of the things we need to look at as a result of Michael Gove's announcement, and this is where the two bits link together, is what is the time frame that the council would want to consider it reasonable to undertake any works. And this is one of the real challenges, because EWS1s look at individual elements, and they are used as a tool to support mortgage lenders on valuation and whether to lend against that. And we have legislation and directives through the Building Safety Act to manage things in a slightly different way. And unfortunately, the two are not. I had a conversation with a leaseholder last week in a meeting, and unfortunately, whilst those two roads and lanes are coming together, they're not joined together at the moment. I think it's important to set out the approach that London Borough of Hackney has taken, as well as Michal said, is we are one of the few, if not the only, London Borough Council that has committed to undertake EWS1 forms, surveys, and then provide that information to the resident. A lot of other boroughs are actually saying there's no requirement on local authorities to do this. Actually, it's down to the individual leaseholders. We didn't want to take that approach. We felt it was better to have a coordinated approach, and that's the approach that the Mayor and Councillor Mackenzie and Cabinet wanted to take, and that's so the way we're actually managing it is much more leaseholder focused, although sometimes leaseholders might not appreciate that when the outcome is not what they want.
Thank you.
Councillor Mahone.
Thanks very much, Chair. Actually, my question sort of leads on and builds on what you were just saying there, Steve. Actually, I mean, I think from casework in my ward, I can't emphasise enough actually how, yeah, exactly what you're saying there. The council has put leaseholders first in this policy, because we've got casework from leaseholders who are leaseholders of large housing associations who have no coordinated strategy for kind of getting EWS ones done, and are these individuals are in a real pickle in terms of trying to move on. What I'm interested to understand, if you have sort of numbers there, is to how much money has the council invested on behalf of leaseholders getting EWS ones done to date. Michal mentioned there's a sort of nominal fee that leaseholders are charged to access those forms, but I assume we've, as a council, spent a lot of money on getting those forms. I wondered if you could sort of give the Commission an idea of that. And then the other thing I was just interested in is how many B2 issues have been picked up that our previous fire safety checks hadn't identified. Thank you.
I'm not aware of the total cost that we've spent on EWS ones. Michal might have that, but certainly we can get that information and circulate it to the Commission. And I'll let Michal answer the second question.
Yeah, so in terms of the cost, yeah, I mean, this is a quite a complex calculation, because obviously it's not only the cost of the specialist fire engineering company that we need to employ, but also we also have to arrange for a separate contractor to allow access, because those often are intrusive surveys, and we need to get those fire engineers up to the first, second story, externally. So there's another cost to that. So actually, I'm in the process of putting together a I've been in the role of only 3 months, so I'm putting together all the budgets and everything from my team. And as part of that, I will be reviewing that specific cost. But it is much more than the £750 that we charge our leaseholders. In terms of the B2 rated items, so just to go back to my presentation quickly, I think I put that we've identified so far 22 buildings with a B2 rated survey as part of the EWS1 process. When it comes to the comparing that to actual findings of the fire risk assessment, and why haven't we picked this up previously? So just to give you a bit of a context, so the EWS1 process is actually applying compliance of building regulations, current building regulations, to existing buildings. So in that respect, this is something that we have never ever done previously in fire safety, because obviously that's just not the way things are done. And that has created this massive problem, like explained to the leaseholders, and obviously puts a lot of pressure as well on the landlords and my team, you know, in terms of how do we deal with that, because obviously there's no way for us to be able to foresee what the future regulations will be when we build and refurbish buildings, right? So we only work towards the current building regulations that are applicable at the time. And so it's very difficult to actually answer this question whether we've been able to pick up those items, because we were not able to pick up those items because we've never assessed against current building regulations compliance. What the new legislation, the Fire Safety Act, as I said in my presentation, will do, it will now require us by law to take the spread of external or spread of fire externally, a risk of that, to take into consideration as part of the fire risk assessment, overall fire risk assessment. So we will be doing that, what the EWS1 process is doing now. The difference will be, though, we will be taking overall fire safety of the building into consideration, including the external spread. And the EWS1 process is a binary approach, which actually just confirms that you have this element of the building that could potentially spread fire or is potentially combustible. But it doesn't, what it doesn't do a fire risk assessment of the whole you know, exposure of risk to residents from that element. And that is the new process that we will be implementing. And for that, we have this guidance on approved code of practice, PAS 9980, which will tell us exactly how we are meant to be doing that. Hope it's answered your question.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
If those numbers, once they're sort of collated, that'll be helpful to share if possible.
Sure.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
of course.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I call Councillor Giles, could I ask you, Mr. Jakovic, just to try and keep your answers a bit briefer? I know you're passionate about this subject and you know a lot about it, but there's lots of members have questions, and I'd like to bring as many as possible in. So I'd like to call Councillor Joseph next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation. Just a couple of quick questions. Basically, the Grenfell inquiry revealed that there was, Damien, I'm just asking a question, that there was a not perhaps adequate staffing in terms of building control. There was one building control inspector expected to cover the materials put on the buildings across the whole borough. And he said that in previous times he'd worked with a partner, but they'd had staff cuts and there was cost pressures. And I just wondered, obviously in the climate that we're in at the moment, to what extent do you think cost pressures are affecting our ability to properly review the materials that are going on our buildings, if in fact you think that is an issue? And another quick one, I'm wondering about our enforcement of appropriate materials on non-council buildings. How do we do that? I mean, obviously through the planning process, but who is really looking at the original materials that are going on buildings that aren't our council developments? And finally, just in the report, there was a mention about resident refusal sometimes being a bit of a hindrance in terms of getting things done. And I just wondered, I mean, to what extent are residents actually allowed to refuse new doors, for example? Cheers. Thanks very much.
I'll try and pick those up. I think obviously from a cost pressure, I think, you know, I've been really pleased. Obviously I've been in Hackney 6 months now, and I've been really pleased to see that the focus that's been put on resident safety and fire safety within the council and housing services, I think has been, yes, it is challenging, but we recognise the importance of it, and therefore we have the resources to be able to do the checks that we need to do. Obviously, as we move forward and what will come out of further phases of Grenfell and further phases of the Building Safety Act, is likely to put additional cost pressures on us. But I think I don't think I would be speaking out of turn, and Councillor Mackenzie's on this call to say that actually the council will recognise those and meet those, because fire safety and resident safety is the heart of what we do. With regards to resident refusal, I suppose just without going into detail, I've had a meeting this morning with regards to a particular building where we're trying to do work, and we've got a number of residents that are refusing to let us in, tenants and leaseholders. So I've been quite clear. Yes, we need to explain to residents, we need to explain the importance of what we're doing, why we're doing it. But the bottom line is, this is health and safety and critical work. And we will support those residents, but we will access that property. And if that means having to go to court to get the appropriate access, then we will. That has been one of the contentious things, I think, for landlords across the country. You know, one of the suggestions coming out of the building safety bill before it became an act was that we'd have to inspect every fire door every 3 months. And to do that properly, we need to get access to every property every 3 months. Now that seems to have gone to every 12 months, but we still need to get access to be able to do that work. So it's actually what powers for enforcement will come with the bill, and we'll have to wait and see as that moves forward. With regards to enforcement on private sector, James Goddard is on the call, and I think he's got his hand up next, but obviously this sits with his side of the private sector team rather than housing services.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions, and then I'll bring Councillor Rathbone in. Can I go back to page 13 and 14 on the risk assessments? It says we've completed 72.8% of the high risk assessments, and there's 16% in progress. I'm interested in particularly in the 16% in progress and 11.2 in the active future programs, of what actually this means. When the ones in progress, yeah, I assume this is for 2021, and we're now in 2022. So when are they going to start, and how long will they take, and what sort of works are we talking about, and when will they finish? And same for the ones in the future programs. And do you consider this this percentage, I mean, obviously you probably do, 72.8 of all works completed, to be a good result for 2021? And you may not know, but how does that compare to the year beforehand? And what are we taking the action to make sure that we improve for 2022 as well? And can I ask, it may have been answered, I'm sorry, I'm struggling to hear a bit. On the new properties, I understand that the fire safety team makes comments at the plan on the council's new properties, that is, and makes comments at the planning stage, and perhaps checks them over at the end. But I was wondering, is there any involvement? And if there isn't, should there be involvement from our fire safety officers checking what builders are actually building, what sort of providing in the way of materials, and checking that they actually know what they're providing? I had an experience at a meeting I was at where I asked about some floor covering, and the builders didn't know how good or bad it was. And when they went away and researched it, they found out that it provided very poor fire safety rather than good fire safety. So I would like to be assured that our fire safety team are in there checking what builders are providing, because I'm not sure they always know what they're meant to provide. Yeah, I'll and on the private sector, I know we don't have a lot of powers. When James comes in, perhaps I could ask him whether James Goddard, what work we've been doing with the housing associations, if any, since they're meant to be our partners, and they also social housing. And obviously a lot of their tenants are similar to our tenants, and I feel we have a moral responsibility, if not a legal responsibility, to ensure that they meet their fire safety needs. And I'll ask Councillor Rathbone to come in now.
Getting there. Okay. Yeah, thanks. Actually, my questions have been asked were by Councillor Joseph, but I'm interested in the private sector as well. And there is an estate in my ward which there was actually a serious fire on the cladding. And since then, the residents have been pressing the landlord, and at last they've got some kind of agreement. But now they're being forced to go to planning, which is delaying things further, because all the time people are wanting to sell and so on their property. So I just wondered, I heard the answer that awaiting the legislation, but I mean, this is going on right at the moment. So I wondered how much help can be given to residents, first of all, to get their situation sorted, private tenants and residents and leaseholders, how they can get their situation sorted out. And if they've got to go to planning, how is that going to work? Because obviously then they're stuck in the planning queue waiting.
Thank you. Do you want me to come back on some of those, Chair? I think the first bit, I'll pick up a little bit of what Councillor Rathbone said and your final comment around private sector, and I'll let James cover that in the main. The resident safety team doesn't have a role with regards to private sector. It is a team that is funded from council tenants' rents and leasehold service charges, and it is focused on the council's buildings. It's the council's response to managing its responsibilities as a landlord. So whilst we comment on new build, on our new build, we don't get involved in commenting on private sector new build or checking what materials are put on buildings. That's something that's done through planning and building control. With regards to the percentages, yes, I suppose the crux of the question is, are we comfortable with where we are? And it would always be nice to have 100% completed, but actually that percentage of 72.8% of high risk actions completed in 2021, I think whilst it says 2021, that's 2021 financial year, which is 21-22, but actually the 16% of work, and just because you identify it, as Michal said, we manage that through some of the timetable and time frame. Some of the 16%, that work will be complete, but we don't class it as complete until we have got the confirmation of completion and all the certification. It's about holding the contractors that are doing work and the work that we're commissioning to account. So we would not sign something off as complete on the fire risk assessments until we have all the certification to show that that work has been completed and completed to the relevant standards. We will always have some work that needs to be done in a future programme, and as Michal said, unfortunately the pandemic has impacted not just on Hackney but across the board. So some of the work that's in there, is around dry riser installations. It says at the bottom, replacement of some materials, major work which would not have been classed as urgent and too complex to be carried out as a responsive repair. It takes time to put those together in a programme, and then to put that out to tender or draw down from a framework. I think the reassurance I can give you is that on all those actions coming out of those fire risk assessments, we assess it from a risk management perspective to ensure that what mitigation have we got in place, and as a directorate there is a monthly meeting that the Fire Safety Board, which is at directorate level, which reviews this position on a monthly basis. And that's a comprehensive discussion around everything. So it has me, Hal, as the head of resident safety, but it has other directors, it has people from property and asset management, building maintenance. So actually we're reviewing and making sure we're comfortable as we move through that process. And I'll let James answer the private sector bits.
Sorry, James got up.
Thank you, Councillor Patrick. Let's get rid of my hands. I would say, actually, because we realised that the fire safety presentation tonight was about fundamentally the council stock, we've come slightly empty-handed, but we could talk for the next hour and a half on this, but I won't do. Councillor Patrick, I'll do the key points, then I'll hand over to Councillor Mohammed to back me up. Very briefly, I'm going to go back to what Steve Webster said to start with. Legislation is important. Michael Grove's words are welcome, but we do need to get this stuff backed up, and that's been our case for the last 4.5 years, number one. Number two, Hackney Council has led by example here, and that has been very important insofar as it gives us the moral and the otherwise authority to tackle private sector and housing association properties. Driven by Councillor Mohammed, driven by Councillor Mackenzie, we have really worked with our policy statements, our strategy, everything. It's really clear. Hackney Council is pretty much ahead of the stuff that we're doing elsewhere in London. So this is a good thing, which we can build upon. That's a really important and fundamental point. Better renting campaign, everything else is all sort of around the edge, and that's really important too. Private sector, I'm being very brief here. More than happy to bring back this stuff and go through it in more detail. Councillor Joseph, you said the point about enforcement, and it's come up again and again. In summary, we have inspected, we've looked at around 250 blocks in Hackney. We've come down to around 6, of which 3 have needed intervention works. Okay, one of those blocks was a mixture of private and housing association. There is one block we are dealing with at the moment. We are drawing up a notice to be served on it. I can't identify that. This is a public meeting. Yeah, but I can talk to you outside, and I'm happy to do that. I'll bring it back here. When we inspect blocks, we don't just pick up cladding. We look at everything. So compartmentation, alarms, safety breaks, design, you name it. Yeah, we go through the whole lot. We do have enforcement powers on some of this stuff. Perhaps not as much as we would like, but that's where we are lobbying the Secretary of State, and we need to carry on doing that. And I'm again happy to talk about that. As I say, at the moment, we are serving a notice on a block in the southern part of Hackney, and we do that, and we have done that before. We work with housing. The good thing that I deal with housing associations and I deal with private sector landlords, the fact, as you've heard from Steve and you've heard from Michael about what Hackney is doing and how we've led that, gives me an awful lot of weight on the team to say, this is what we do, and this is what we expect of you. That has, by and large, worked, not in all cases, okay? And mainly with our housing associations, it has worked. Councillor McMahon, I get your point, and I hear that stuff all the time. Councillor Mwema and I are dealing with other blocks and other residents throughout Hackney, and we will advise, send them my way, we will advise, and we'll do everything we can to intervene and threaten with enforcement as a last resort if we have to, okay? Councillor Rathbone, I don't know what the estate is. If you want to tell me outside of this, lob it over to me, we'll pick it up. So I don't know the issues. I don't know what there are there. We may already have inspected it. We may already know about it, but please let me know and I'll pick those up as well. I'm gonna shut up there. That's a very brief summary from me. If I link with Council Member just to add on to that, and then Councillor Patrick, I can come back. I'm aware you don't like officers talking too much, so I'll defer to Councillor Moema.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be really brief. And just in response to Councillor Joseph's and Councillor Rathbone's point, I guess the oblique issue here is that we have a number of leaseholders in the borough who are affected by fire safety issues. Michael Gove's statements the other day talked about non-cladding fire safety. So obviously there are issues around what happens in the case of those people who are shared owners in particular concern, maybe older leaseholders who are not in a position to remortgage, and those people who are on an average income, if you like, who are leaseholders as well. So that covers a whole range of people. And I think what I would say is that there is, perhaps slightly different to the council situation, there is the ultimate issue of who covers the costs of those works once identified, and how those costs are covered or spread by by landlords or freeholders for those leaseholders who are affected. And there have been a lot of good examples of people spreading costs if they are people have to pay. But we've had a couple of recent examples where people in Hackney who live here are really terrified of the bill that they've received. And I think the issue that perhaps the committee, I don't know if you could take this further in a future meeting, could look at is how to really just plug that gap. So Section 20s are perfectly valid, for example, in these circumstances. And there is real concern. And I would say the issues that Steve has highlighted, this is just kind of finger in the air stuff, but I imagine those leaseholders that are concerned about the council or a landlord coming into a property to inspect is that they're worried about what will be uncovered and therefore what will be rechargeable to them. I think there is an issue about who covers the costs. So that work around lobbying the government is really, really important. And yeah, as Jane said, we're really happy to come to speak to you about in a lot more detail about the work that we have been doing and just see what comparisons there are across the board. The final thing I would say is that in terms of staffing, Steve's team has got a very good structure. We've got Mihail in place, and on the private sector side, that is not something that is in place in the exact same way in terms of staff numbers available to inspect and to do all of that work across the borough. So that is definitely something which I would say we could do a lot more if we did have an equivalent size team in the private sector side to really deal with those landlords.
Thank you, Councillor Mahim. I've got one last question. It's not linked to the actual work. I know this is an update. Obviously, after Grenfell, we wrote to all our residents and gave them advice on whether to stay put or whether to evacuate. Obviously, people forget that sort of information, and people move in and move out, etc. I was just wondering, with all the signs that we're putting up, whether we could actually put permanent signs up in blocks with the instructions of what to do if there's a fire. Not so like, so that the same like the floor numbers and the dry rise and those sorts of signs saying to people, this is a stay put block, this is an evacuate block, etc., which I think would ensure that tenants and residents regularly see the information, and so they know. Obviously, we hope there won't be any fires and people won't have to evacuate, and all the work that we're doing will keep people safe. But I do think it's worth reinforcing that message, and I do think if there were signs in the blocks rather than writing perhaps to individual may assist so that people see it all the while, it just stays in their mind. We can make a recommendation from this panel. Unless anybody else has got any, Councillor out, sorry.
Okay, I'm on. Thank you, Chair. Two quick things. I noticed recently that the Chair of Planning had expressed some disappointment that Hackney is still fitting PVC windows when it's doing up places. And I'm not sure why he was expressing disappointment about that. I don't know if it was a fire safety issue or an environmental one or an aesthetic one. I don't know. But I just wondered whether we are comfortable that PVC windows will continue to be safe into the future. And the other thing I was wondering was, one of the problems that I think Grenfell showed to some extent was that there was at least a gap sometimes between approved materials at planning stage and what actually gets fitted at building stage. And I just wondered if anybody in the room is capable of, if they know enough about the government's legislation to know whether or not that loophole has changed, because I know that it was something that was quite worrying, that materials can be changed as value engineering, I think it's called, often creeps into developments, and whether or not that loophole is now gone.
Is there someone that could pick up those questions or partially answer them?
So I can pick up the question about the fire action notices that you asked, Councillor. So we do actually have a project in place, which we are heading towards completion, where we've fitted majority of our buildings with fire action notices, indicating what action residents need to take in case of an emergency. So those signs are installed in the lobby areas of each building. So that's something that we've already completed. In terms of the other question in regards to PVC windows, the glazing, in terms of fire safety, glazing element of the building is excluded from the fire safety kind of fire risk assessment process. So I guess this comment from the planning might have been in regards to perhaps U value of those windows or aesthetic element. And in terms of the gap or value engineering, actually in Hackney, as part of the gateway process with the regeneration team, we actually have the reverse of the value engineering, which means that we put safety over any costs. So on some of our schemes, or actually a scheme that I've been involved with the regeneration team, we have went over and above what the current level of legislation is, and made changes to the design which actually will affect the potential kind of cost of the project, but it will not lower the cost of the project. It will actually increase the cost of the project, but with prioritizing of fire safety.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been a very interesting update, and it sounds like we're ahead of the game as usual, and I'm sure next year we will ask for another update on the work that's been got on, and see that we're even further ahead on our fire safety work than we are already. I'd like to call a break for 5 minutes, and so we'll come back, make it 6 minutes. We'll come back at 5 minutes past 8 to start the private sector discussion. Thank you. Okay, welcome back everybody, and we're going to move on to item 5, which is the private sector housing licensing scheme update. This session will cover the private sector housing licensing scheme and exploring an extension to the scheme across the borough. The guests expected on this item, I'd like to welcome to the meeting are Councillor Sem Mahima, who we've already heard from in the previous item, and James Goddard, who we've also heard from, is the Interim Director of Regeneration. And we have a presentation from the private sector housing team. I'd like to invite James Goddard to start his presentation, please.
Thanks, Councillor. I'm going to actually ask Tracy if she can load the presentation for me. That way I can speak and see you all at the same time. I would also say that we have Kevin Thompson on the call as well. Kevin is the head of the private sector housing team. So Kevin and I will go through this double team as well as a bit. So thank you, Tracy.
Welcome to Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Councillor. So yeah, I hope you can all see that. We will take you through a few slides on the licensing scheme by way of an update, and we can have a bit of discussion, questions, etc. at the end of the normal thing. Thanks, Tracy. If you could do the next slide, please, I'd be grateful. So by way of revision and memory, there are when we talk about licensing, there are 3 licensing schemes in Hackney. Firstly, it's the national applicable. This is the mandatory licensing scheme for houses in multiple occupation, HMOs. So this scheme, this applies to those larger, multiply occupied homes. So basically with 5 or more unrelated occupiers, where we have kind of 1 or more of the occupiers sharing basic amenities like a kitchen, bathroom, washing facilities. That's been around for a while. I'll come to timescales in a moment. We also have what's known as the additional licensing scheme. This is borough-wide, this is discretionary, and this is for all the houses in multiple occupation that aren't covered by the national mandatory scheme above. Yeah, so with only 3 or 4 occupiers, again, we have that in Hackney. Finally, we have our pilot discretionary selective licensing scheme. That covers all privately rented dwellings, not covered by the 2 schemes above, but all private rented dwellings in 3 wards: Brownswood, Cazenove and Stoke Newington, up in the northern part of the borough. So when we talk about licensing, we do have those schemes. It can be a confusing set of terminology, but in the sense that it's relatively straightforward once you get into it. Timeframes for those schemes, just so again we're all aware, and this will bring us to the discussion at the end. Mandatory HMO licensing, that's been in operation for a while now, 2005, 2006, something like that, I can't remember, but again, it's been a government scheme around for a while. Additional HMO and selective scheme in Hackney came into force in October 2018, and they both have 5-year durations. Their 5 years takes us up to the 30th of September 2023. And no doubt we'll come to this at the end of the meeting, because the future of this, for the 2 HMO schemes, again, we'll talk about the future of those. They'll be made in advance of expiry. Options will include renewing them in their current form, renewing in their revised form, different scope, different coverage, or even to end the schemes. Or why we'd want to do that, but it will be an option. Selective is interesting, and it's different in that to have a selective scheme, you need first an evidence base, and secondly, you need Secretary of State approval. We can come back to that. Actually, across the country, very few local authorities actually have a selective licensing scheme, including in London. You'll probably have heard of boroughs like Enfield, Newham, Barking and Dagenham have selective schemes. A lot don't. So again, from our perspective, Hackney is leading the way here on these schemes and across these schemes. Bearing in mind, we'll come back to those dates in one moment. Tracy, if you could go to the next slide, please, I'd be grateful. Now, why do we do all this stuff? And it's quite obvious. Now, we've got a few slides with a few pictures just to show you the sort of stuff that we encounter in private sector housing on a daily basis across Hackney. As you can see there, very poor conditions, hoarding, rubbish insides, poor external faces, etc., etc. And I'll also come onto the team itself and the numbers. So again, if you go on to the next slide as well, Tracy. The pictures speak for themselves. These, I say, these are live. These are photos that we've dealt with, the cases that we've dealt with recently, the team have dealt with. It won't be a surprise to members that this stuff still exists in Hackney. Unfortunately, it does, and unfortunately, it exists in not small numbers. We deal with this stuff all of the time. These also, I would say, are some of the more palatable pictures. We didn't want to be putting the X-rated stuff up at 8 o'clock in the evening. There are plenty of that as well, should you wish to see that. Next one, please, Tracy. Not just the insides, but the outsides, refuse, rubbish, pests, etc. Problems here. Again, you can see a bathroom. This is actually not as bad as some of the bathrooms we pick out all the time, but I say again, you can see pictures there. Poor plumbing and real people, real households, often quite vulnerable households living in this stuff and being charged a whacking rent. Final slides, please, Tracy. And there's our furry friend. We see lots of those all of the time. And you can see just an example of the kind of dodgy hazards and electrics that we encounter left, right, and centre throughout parts of the stock. Just a bit of perspective in terms of the numbers. We've got around 30,000 units. Councillor Member mentioned this in terms of staffing earlier on. Just to put it in perspective, we've got around 30,000 units of stock in Hackney. That represents the largest growing private rented stock in the UK over the last 20 years. And we've gone from about 3,000 units 25 years ago to 30,000 units now of private rented. It's a massive increase. We have 36 members of staff in total in the private sector housing team dealing with a whole range of things. Not just, as you heard earlier, private fire safety, where we have to drop everything and deal with that, but licensing, grants, enforcement, everything. I'll come on to that in a moment. It's important that we make that. So there's some of the pictures. As I say, we haven't got too many slides and I won't talk for too long, but it's important that we bring this to life and you can see with the stuff that households have to live in. Next slide, please, Tracy. We'll give you some scope. We're going to give you some numbers here. So across the whole of Hackney, in terms of scope and so on and so forth, we've got, as you can see from the slide there, it's relatively straightforward. We've got around 8,000. These are properties that we estimate from data modelling, so around 8,700 licensable properties across all of those three schemes. When we say likely, that's a definite. There are more schemes out of there, and we do pick them up. Some fall through the net, and we pick them up later. But there are more than those 8,700. I did actually touch upon the timelines earlier, so that's again is a summary. We will distribute this presentation, and we have some papers behind this as well, which we haven't put to you tonight, but we'll get this out in the next days. We'll amend that, so just bear that in mind, councillors. Delivery, again, private sector housing teams currently based in the Chief Executive Directorate, and we have 36 posts, as I've mentioned. Pointing out there that around about 2/3 of the team do devote themselves to licensing. That's everything from the paperwork to the enforcement, the inspections, the going out there, but we also have to devote ourselves to an awful lot more, including enforcement outside of this stuff, fire safety, providing advice, the whole lot. And it's 30,000 units of stock. We are looking at that. I will come back to that. Certainly something for the scrutiny panel to discuss, but we do have our work cut out in Hackney in terms of the resources that we actually deploy to what is a huge and complicated and challenging stock. Tracy, if you could please go to the next slide. Hope you can all see that. This gives you some of the numbers of where we are in terms of our performance. So, as you can see there straightforwardly, across those three schemes, around 8,700 are total licensable. Applications that we've received, nearly 6,000 across a lot of them. Licenses issued is around 3,000. That's the lower point. If you look at the key points there, what is interesting is the applications that we've received, we are ahead of where we thought we'd be at this point when we predicted where we would be in those schemes. So we are ahead of scheme. That is, the applications have come in. Fee income is pretty much spot on exactly where we thought it would be. So we're doing okay there too. Licenses issued is below predicted profile. So we're only around about a third of the licenses that we wanted, we thought we'd do. Sorry, not a third. We are below profile with 34%. We thought at this stage when we modeled it that we would be higher in terms of what we came out there. Now, that's a challenge. The reason that we have lower applications than we thought is twofold, mainly because of the pandemic. So back in March 2020, government introduced restrictions on, frankly, how we could inspect properties. Simple as that. We have had some hit from the cyber attack, but the main issue has been the fact that during the, we've had a year and a half out, more than that, more than that, out of our licensing schemes where, frankly, we've not been able to undertake non-urgent work. It meant that we couldn't inspect. Good news is the application still came in, which is excellent news to Hackney. And we've been putting them in and we've been processing and dealing with them. And the good news is that the fee income is still on target. There is a risk here, though, because not carrying out these inspections means that licenses for that category of premises don't get issued, which could deter future applications, and it can damage landlords' understanding of what we've got in Hackney. So they are key points to bear in mind. Next slide, please, Tracy. I've got ahead of myself there, Councillor. So as I said, I'll run through these quickly again. So applications, licensing inspection, you can see it there, 5,389. The high risk properties are dependent upon inspections. They're the ones we are targeting at the moment. So we are taking corrective action. Inspections are now being undertaken. We can do those. We had the usual gamut, people wouldn't let us in, and all those sorts of things as well. With everything that you heard from Steve and Mikhail earlier on, we've encountered in the private sector. Of course, we do that. We've got inspections back online again. But what we do need is an enhanced inspection regime to catch up, to fill the backlog. If we don't do that, it will impair the success of the scheme. If we have an impaired and non-successful scheme, it makes it harder for us to roll out a selective licensing scheme again, because we will need to provide information and we will need to persuade the Secretary of State. So this is quite important for us to do. We're looking at posts, we're looking at additional resources as we speak as part of our strategy to backfill those inspections. So it's not that we're not doing anything, we are doing stuff, and we will have to do stuff to catch up very quickly in terms of the number of inspections. So in summary on those points, councillors, the schemes are performing broadly in line with our plan profile in terms of licence applications and fee income, despite COVID and despite cyber. So that is good news. They are performing below the profile in terms of licenses issued. Again, that's because of COVID and the restrictions. Corrective actions basically are that we are looking at resourcing and getting more feet on the ground in to do those inspections. That's where we are at the moment. In terms of the broader kind of strategic considerations that you may want to think about, that covers really where the discussion will go. So I've given you a fairly straightforward explanation of where the team is. It doesn't cover the points about where we want to go. So our plan at the moment is to get the inspections done and out of the way so that it can lead us into throughout this year, 2022. So into 2023, we have a clear-cut, strategic, straightforward approach to where we are with these schemes. That could include, you may well recommend that we expand a selective scheme across the whole of Hackney or parts of Hackney and do other stuff as well. There are options here. What I would say is that you can see some of the conditions that we deal with. That licensing schemes are an absolute critical tool in how the team responds and how we deal with stuff as a borough as well. Make no mistake about that, and including the rationale for a selective scheme as a pilot. Our aim is to use the findings that we find from that pilot in order to fill in an evidence base that will allow us to work out how or whether we expand that. So it's really critical. And I know it's slides on a screen, and I know it's words on a screen, but I have to say that we do deal with people and households every single day in really, really disturbing circumstances. And that's why we have these schemes in place. And the 36 officers in that team, not all of them deal with enforcement because they can't, but a lot do have to deal with this stuff. So we welcome We'd welcome any debate, any discussion, questions. I've raced through that again, very summary wise. I'll hand over to Kevin or Councillor Mermer if they'd like to add anything to that, but otherwise, Councillor Patrick, it will be over to you. Kevin, Councillor Mermer.
Yes, hi, Councillor. Thanks for that, James. I think you've covered the headlines there. I don't think I have anything more to add other than just to reinforce that last heading there, corrective action. It really is essential that we get some feet on the ground, as you've said, to recover on those missed inspections to try and catch up. And then we'll have the evidence moving forward, but also to get these licenses out and get that 34% up more towards the 67% of applications. That's what we really need.
Thanks, Kevin.
I guess the only thing I would add at this point is just, obviously we've been impacted by COVID, but just by way of background and casting our minds back, we've started this this brief from a standing start. You'll remember back in 2016, this was a commitment that we made in the manifesto, and I'm sure people will have questions about why this function of the council is separate from, for example, housing services. That's an intentional decision. I'm happy to pick that up in questions. And yes, it's just really important to think about how we can serve residents and how we can make sure that where possible we can support people in the private rented sector, as well as the previous conversation around fire safety, because obviously some of those people will be tenants in private buildings. So thank you.
Thank you. I've got a question. I mean, perhaps I was interested. So I know why we set the scheme up to try and deal with some of the problems and to make sure that our private sector housing is in good condition. Out of the licenses we have issued, I assume some of the photos that you've shown us are perhaps attached to some of those properties. Perhaps you could tell us about what learning we found and perhaps if any enforcement action has had to be taken out of all the licenses that we've issued, mainly the ones the ones in the north of the borough, and the additional licensing scheme rather than the mandatory licensing scheme, which obviously is across the country. Rather, I'd like to hear about the Hackney scheme and obviously whether you think it's been successful so far. I know it's early days yet, and we've been affected by the pandemic and the cyber attack, which has obviously pushed the scheme backwards.
Thanks, Councillor. I'll just say a little bit quickly, but then I'll hand over to Kevin, who can provide a bit more detail on this as he day-to-day runs the scheme. I would say, wouldn't I, that licensing schemes are of great benefit to a local housing authority. When we look at landlords, when we look at properties, the licensing scheme itself, a bit of practical stuff here. We don't just look at the brick and mortar. Of course we do. That's very important, but we also look at landlord history, etc., by property. We don't just give one license per landlord. This is done individually. So it's a very good scheme, and we go in there in detail. It allows us to pick up really detailed stuff. It allows us to put stuff in place on the ground. No messing. Everyone in those wards that's not covered by those schemes, if you haven't got a license, you can't rent your property. It's as simple as that. This is a fundamental approach for us here. Yes, unfortunately, the pandemic has cut across that, as Councillor Member pointed out, as has the cyber attack. It's just, what can we do? Nevertheless, we have a good scheme in place that really is monitored on a day-to-day basis, which has allowed us to improve conditions on the ground for people straightforwardly. We can evidence that. It doesn't just pick up the private sector stuff as well, Councillor. Think about the whole neighbourhood itself as well. So it brings in additional benefits too. We're not just looking at private sector housing, we're looking at the street, we're looking at the place, we're looking at the people around there too. There's another benefit here that I can't emphasise enough. Kevin, do you want to give any detail on like the day-to-day stuff? Oh, by the way, Councillor, yeah, those pictures do come from licensing schemes. I say that we toned them down a bit. I can show you some horrendous stuff outside of this if you like. Over to you, Kevin.
Yes, thanks, Chair. What we're finding on the ground compared to what we expected, well, the data modelling that we did at the outset, which enabled us to introduce schemes, indicated to us that for the HMO stock, that there would be about 20% of the stock would have serious hazards and poor conditions. Now we've got into the inspections, we're actually finding that it's more like 50%. So conditions are actually far worse than the modelling actually indicated. So that clearly vindicates the introduction of the additional licensing scheme for HMOs, which we didn't have to do. It clearly vindicates that. Now, on the selective scheme in the 3 wards in the north, it's a little bit too soon to call on that one. We are now getting into the inspections there, but we focused on the high-risk HMOs as soon as we were able to restart inspections. So we've got quite good data on the HMOs, but for the selective scheme, that's developing. So I can't really give you a good outcome assessment for that scheme yet. The data modelling indicated that around 17 and 18% would have poor conditions. So we'll be measuring it against that. The data that we gather is really important because we're going to have to make a decision on what we do after September 2023, on what we do with the schemes and whether we expand them. And the opportunity to expand them will be entirely dependent on good data, which we are gathering as we go along. But on the selective scheme, watch this space. We can report back to you next time with much better outcomes on that one. What I would say is that it's not simply about the actual conditions we find and the action we take. One thing about licensing is that some people don't always appreciate is that it's completely turned the culture of our interventions in the private rent sector on its head. Prior to licensing, we operated a reactive scheme. So tenants would come to us with complaints and we would respond. And only in that situation did we actually engage with the landlords. Those that did were not subject to complaint from tenants or from neighbours, etc., were basically off the radar, and we had no engagement with them. With licensing, they are legally obliged to come to us and engage with us from the start. So for all those license applications that have come in, those thousands that James showed there, they are now on the radar with us and are engaged with us. Once the license is issued, it has conditions attached to it, requiring them to comply with all the various criteria for good renting and better renting. And if they don't, then there are strict penalties there already in place immediately. Before licensing, all we could do would be require them to put their house in order, and then if they failed to put the house in order, we would issue them with enforcement. So it was a long-winded arm's length situation. Now we're fully engaged. If they don't comply with the conditions on the license, they're creating a criminal offence and are in trouble. Now the compliance team there are really starting to get into their stride as well, which we haven't talked about yet. They were also hampered with their activities because they also couldn't go and carry out enforcement activities in these properties because it requires a physical inspection, and they were not permitted to do that under COVID also. So we lost a year and a half of enforcement there, but we are now really getting ramping that up. We've got about, I think, 25 civil penalty notices going out as we speak for failure to license. And those numbers are going to only increase now as we carry out more inspections. And that should encourage more compliance when we do the comms work around that. So all those things around licensing that we're doing now, prior to licensing, just didn't exist. So we have turned around the culture considerably. It takes some time to work its way through, but we are seeing the fruits of our labours in that. So I think that's really all I needed to say there.
Councillor Rathbone and then Councillor Mahan.
Thank you very much, Chair. And just to say thank you to the team for all their work. It really is quite encouraging because the private rented sector is growing in Hackney, and there are many people in quite difficult circumstances, as you would be more aware than even I am. Just a couple of questions. One was, is there anywhere where you can actually see the necessary criteria for a good premises, you know, with the standard of a bathroom, the standard of a kitchen? Is there somewhere on the website of the council, or is there anything that we could see which shows you the kind of criteria that should be followed by landlords? And then secondly, I've just been looking at the dreadful pictures that James has provided, and for instance, the place which is like a shed extension, it's got a mop, it's strangely propped up outside the door. In that particular example, for instance, obviously it's completely inadequate and disgraceful, the provision. But how would it work out? Would you actually specify exactly what needs to be changed and improved? What would happen to the tenants if it was a major restructuring, as it were, needed of the premises? I'm not asking for any details, but I just think it's important to know how these premises are improved, and the length of time. Is there a particular specified time? You say after 6 months, for example, you should have reached this particular standard. If you haven't, then you take them to court. Thank you.
Yes, I think I'll come in there, Chair, for me. First of all, standards, published standards. There are published standards sort of for landlords across the web, really. We've got some information on our website, but it's a little bit difficult to put detailed standards on there because the way the system works now, it's all done on risk assessments rather than prescribed standards. So we do have some on there, and we do have standard license conditions that they should comply with. What we do encourage, we support the London Landlord Accreditation Scheme for landlords. Hackney Council supports that, and we've carried out some development courses here in Hackney. We encourage landlords to sign up to that, and that gives them all the information they need, both on physical standards of properties and on good management. So we do promote that. Regarding the poor conditions in what looked like a shed there in the photographs, it wasn't much more than a shed. What we do, we inspect and we carry out a full assessment over a range of hazards, and we identify all the defects that are there. We then have to assess them against prescribed scores, and we score them up. And we then develop a schedule of works that are required to bring that property up to the reasonable standard. We then have to make a decision on what action we will take in relation to that property, what is called the most satisfactory course of action. And that can be, and is most commonly, the service of an improvement notice to put things right. If we serve an improvement notice to put things right, we specify a start date for the works and we specify a completion date for the works, and they will be determined on the scope of the works and the situation relating to that particular case, because they'll all be different. Some will just be maybe a quick fix, maybe a new boiler. Some will be a comprehensive refurbishment. So that's how we do that. It's a criminal offence not to comply with those notices, and they can be issued with civil penalty notices for that. Or if conditions are really poor, like the ones you saw in the photographs, we will prosecute. And I think we did 4 prosecutions last year, and we're looking to do more. The alternative actions are if the properties are so dire that it really isn't practical to bring them up to scratch and they shouldn't have been lived in the first place, then we punish, which prohibits that property from being used for human habitation. And again, it's an offence not to comply with that.
Thanks. If I could just ask supplementary question, just that for those members of the public who might be listening to this broadcast at some point, who are private renters, is there somewhere where they can actually contact the team to say that my premises are not in very good condition, and can they do that anonymously, or how would that work? Because I'm quite sure that there will be people who will be thinking, how can I get my landlord to improve the poor conditions that are being provided?
Yes, absolutely. On the website under landlords and tenants, private landlords and tenants, on that web page, there's information on how to contact the team. They can do it by email, or there's a telephone line there that's open 9 o'clock until 4 o'clock Monday to Friday to lodge a complaint. We will take anonymous complaints, but we would encourage them not to be anonymous, because it's rather difficult for us to take robust action if we don't have engagement with the tenant themselves, because we have to get in there, we have to inspect, etc. So we would try and work with the tenants and bring them on board with us. But if there is a real concern there regarding the backwash from making an inspection, then we've got good support from the housing advice team to support them, and there are rules and laws that prevent retaliatory evictions. But we do appreciate that it's a difficult thing to do in some circumstances, but we would work with the tenants as fully as we can to work through that.
Councillor Mahan.
Thanks very much, Chair. Just a quick one, but picking up on the interruption that COVID has sort of brought on the inspections, which is, you know, is disappointing to us as councillors that supported bringing the scheme in, but also to many of our residents, you know, who are kind of looking on us to really bring the sort of, you know, small percentage but nonetheless persistent cases of landlords not doing right by their tenants. And I wonder, is there any scope for the duration of the scheme to be extended to reflect the impact that that's had on rolling it out, or just mindful of the fact that us as an authority looking to assemble that evidence base to support you know, an application when the current scheme expires, and if that's something that has been considered and explored. Thank you.
In answer to the query about the extension of the scheme, I would really wish that were the case, but unfortunately it's categorically not, because the duration of the schemes is written into the Housing Act 2004 specifically, that schemes may not extend beyond the 5-year period. That doesn't apply to the national mandatory scheme because that's ongoing, but our Hackney discretionary ones, the additional and selective, they must end on 30th September 2023, and then we have the option to renew them. We can't extend them, we have to start all over again and go through the whole process and make the case for a further 5-year scheme. So it's quite bureaucratic, it's quite labour intensive and resource intensive, but that situation on that one, I would say that it was hugely frustrating for all of us. And I attend the GLA private sector partnership for London boroughs every 8 weeks, and we had it last week, and colleagues in pretty much every borough were having the same issue that we're having here, and I assume it's the same across the whole country. So it's hugely frustrating. What I would say is that whilst we couldn't carry out the routine inspections at all, where we had complaints of really serious conditions, critical conditions, we were able, we managed to deal with most of them remotely by contacting landlords by telephone, by email, sending photographs, cajoling them along to deal with the issues. And the majority of them we did manage to get done with quite a lot of effort, but the critical ones we did get done. It's really the routine licensing inspections that we need to do to unearth those poor conditions, and also to improve those conditions through licensing, and also to provide the data moving forward. It's those ones where we were really stuck, and the non-urgent complaints. So a lot of the service requests we get from tenants are perfectly valid from their point of view, really things that you don't want to live with, but are not categorized as serious hazards. Those ones we couldn't do either. We have a backlog there which we've been catching up with. So it's been hugely frustrating, but we're looking forward now to moving forward.
Councillor McMahon, just very briefly, we did attempt to lobby the previous Secretary of State, you may recall, Robert Jenrick, to no avail. Even though the Housing Act says what it says, a point was made by various local authorities that perhaps we would consider an extension. we did not get much change from that particular Secretary of State. So we are where we are. We're looking at evidence base, as Kevin has just said. You know what the timescales are, so we'll bring that together and we'll have that there for strategic discussion on how we take that scheme forward. We tried.
Well, we know who the government represent, don't we? But thanks for trying.
Can I just just really quickly, I suppose people here will see things like the number of prosecutions, for example, criticism or not of council. And I suppose in the back of my mind, as the lead for this particular area, is that ultimately we do not want to make people homeless. Now, it's obvious that people should not be living in sheds in this day and age, but I think it would be for the committee to look in the round about whether or not the numbers of prosecutions or otherwise is indicative of anything. My personal view is that ultimately it would be preferable for this council to have Kevin's team and James to ensure that landlords put their houses right, literally and metaphorically, put them right so that people can continue to live in them, rather than go through a full process of prosecution, which is costly and it's time consuming for those staff. The other really quick thing I would say is that during the pandemic, there was an opportunity to look at some of the, if you like, the theoretical work. We were able to work with, for example, some of the grow renters, and something like that would not have happened if the team had been out inspecting in person. And you know, things like the scheme now being that the council goes out proactively rather than waiting means that the balance of who are the people that come forward and we inspect and enforce against bad landlords is very much shifted to, I think, better represent the profile of your average Hackney renter, who is a family on a low to middle income, as opposed to those people who might otherwise think to come to the council, which does go some way to address Councillor Rathbone's point about what happens in the cases of people who might want to do things anonymously. We are trying to go to people rather than wait for them to come to us.
Councillor Rahima, Councillor Wright, did you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. A couple of things. First of all, Kevin said that in the most extreme cases where the place was unfit for human habitation, they would close it down altogether. I wonder, have you actually done any? Have you closed any? And if so, how many? The other thing I was wondering was, it does seem to me that James is sort of saying that we're struggling with the resources that we've got to do this, and that the need for those resources is a bit relentless, really. I can see that it's only going to grow, because as we catch up with ourselves and grant the licenses that we're behind with, we're going to be constantly looking to check compliance and what have you. So I suppose my question is, how many extra staff do we need to do this job thoroughly? And a question which you may not be able to answer, but it's worth asking anyway, which is that in those areas which haven't got the discretionary licensing, I wonder if there's been any, if you've noted any kind of impact at all on the private landlords, in particular, I suppose, in areas like Stamford Hill or Shacklewell, which are neighbouring the wards which have got this pilot scheme. Is there any sign of it having any impact on the private rented sector outside of those wards at all?
Prohibition orders. Yes, we do prohibition orders. We've done quite a few. I haven't got the exact number, but I can get it and have it forwarded to you. They are a last resort in the worst conditions, but we do them. I think 2 of the properties that you saw on the photographs there were subject to prohibition orders. We've done others. We often do them on fire safety, particularly where we have units above commercial premises. We did one recently on that score, and we've done quite a few of them. I can get the figures and send them through. What staff numbers we need, James and I have done some modelling on various scenarios. but we don't have them here tonight because we weren't expecting to be presenting those. But we have done some modelling on various scenarios on what we can do, and obviously the different models are what we focus those staff on, what we want them to do, and then the more numbers we have, the quicker we get through the backlog, etc. So we've done various modelling on those. Effect on areas outside the selective licensing scheme. That was one of the risks that we put in our original risk assessment to Cabinet. Would it displace bad behaviour to vary it towards outside? Would it have any effect at all? We don't actually have any data on it, but we haven't really seen any particular spike in activity in those areas around the selective scheme, but we're a little bit hampered again in our data on that because we've lost 16 months because of the cyber attack again. I mean, the COVID problem again. The cyber attack didn't help, but that's not really the issue. It was the COVID restrictions. And I sometimes feel a bit embarrassed using that as an answer to queries because it almost sounds like it's a bit of a mantra for an excuse, but it really isn't. It's just if you have 16 months taken out of a 5-year licensing scheme, it will obviously have an effect on what your database is there. So we're going to need to work through this next period and get our data in place, and then we'll be able to see whether it's had an effect on those surrounding areas and also what effect it's having in the areas itself. So that's where we are on that.
We will need to do that. Sorry, coming over you, Kevin, Councillor Wright, we will need to do that because it's the evidence base. It's a critical part of the evidence base, particularly if you're looking at extending a scheme. So that is point one. Point two, I do welcome the discussion about resources. It's not my place to speak openly about these things. People can speak much more clearly than I can. We have modelled it. We have looked at the team. We have compared, for example, Hackney with comparable boroughs like Islington and Camden. So we've done a lot of work on this. We're happy to share outside. I won't pull punches. We do need more resources. We have a smaller team than comparisons.
If I could really quickly comment on that point about resources, Councillor Root. Obviously, the current situation has got the 3 wards in the north, the rest of the borough in the selective, and then all other HMOs. If we were to, and I guess the context is the fire safety situation did not exist when we started this as well. So that is a new obligation that we have, which we didn't have when this team was modelled. So there is a logical kind of exponential growth of how the team might work if we were to expand it, and that would be a best case scenario. That we obviously don't have finite resources in terms of the council tax base and additional cost pressures that we have. So we need to think about how we can. I would obviously love to see the team expand, and I'll definitely would push for that. I think we need to think about how it works in the round and think about, first of all, what the team is doing, what additional responsibilities have been added to that, and how the team works with other housing functions within the council. We work really closely with, for example, housing needs and homelessness, for what I hope are obvious reasons, and just making sure that those resources are not too thinly stretched. But again, from that point that we started from ground zero 4 and a bit years ago, 5 years ago, sorry. So we're in a good position, but obviously the issues that you raise about looking behind us, now we've had some success about licensing, are really important, and we need to regularize some of that and make sure that we don't overstretch residents' expectations of us, and we keep our residents satisfied, as you rightly say. So that will be a conversation about funding in the future as we look to hopefully expand the scheme.
Councillor Joseph.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all. It's really, really great to hear more about this work that's been going on. I was just wondering to what extent we were working with neighbouring boroughs. I know you mentioned that the majority of boroughs weren't doing these experimental schemes, but which are, and how are we sort of working with them or sharing resources? I mean, are there landlords that operate across boroughs? For example, and do we track them? Do we share information on them? Those kind of things, really, I was just interested in. Thank you.
The answer is yes. I mentioned the GLA partnership, which all my counterparts from all the boroughs attend every 8 weeks. We share lots of information and good practice. There are small subgroups that are set up under that to look at specific areas of work. As far as landlords operating across boroughs, they certainly do. The GLA have what we call a rogue landlords database. So every time a civil penalty or prosecution is carried out, that is entered onto that database, and all other boroughs and indeed residents can go on there and look and see. So if you're proposing, there are two parts to that database. There's a local authority closed area, and then there's a public area. The public area has all the prosecutions and the civil penalties on it that have been done and dusted and sorted. So if you are a prospective tenant, you can go on there and search for a landlord and see if they're on there. So there is a lot of information sharing on that. And then there are also leading from that, because we have such a good contact list of networks through that partnership, we're able to just contact other boroughs and make individual inquiries in specific scenarios. So we do work very well together. In fact, we work better together now than I've ever known since I've been in this area of work, which is quite some time.
Yeah, and we do that, Councillor Joseph, without the selective licensing schemes. I'll come back to that. We do that anyway, as it were. We do have quite close links with a lot of boroughs, Islington, Tower Hamlets, on a day-to-day basis, which we do. Selective schemes will help. I'm aware of Enfield, Newham, Barking and Dagenham. Kevin, there might be others in London, but I think that's it at the moment, isn't it? There's those three. Certainly, and they're different as well, Councillor Joseph. They're all borough, as far as I'm aware. We are pilot in the 3 wards, but the others are all borough. So again, something to think about. Also a point, if you look at the selective licensing schemes across England, this is important as well. So when those schemes have come up for renewal in the last 2 years or so, the previous Secretary of State refused every single renewal application of every single scheme, including most notably Liverpool. Liverpool have a whole city-wide scheme. It was turned down by Genric on all sorts of reasons. The point being here is also we are learning from other boroughs like Newham, who are slightly ahead of us, and Enfield, in how you use your data, your arguments to get renewals stuff in place. But I'm not going to pull punches on that one either. It will, as Kevin said, it's not just bureaucratic. It will take us. It's a hurdle we have to jump over.
On the coverage of licensing schemes in London, there's an excellent website, londonpropertylicensing.com. Which is an ex-colleague of mine, actually, who set this up, and it has details of every borough in London, what schemes they have, what the coverage is, details of those schemes. It's really an excellent resource. It's for landlords as well as other local authorities and residents, but it's really good if you're interested. londonpropertylicensing.com.
I mean, Chair, I hope you don't mind me just asking a very brief follow-up, but that's interesting actually to see, I mean, the response to the other boroughs and to Liverpool. I mean, just going back to what you were saying, that you'd actually found that, in fact, there was a far higher number of really serious issues than you'd originally anticipated. I mean, you would think that if that data was widely known, and was it, I mean, more in the public domain, and I mean, we are seeing more media interest in things like housing disrepair, but it's generally been like local authority that's made the news, or housing association. So, I mean, what do you think will help put pressure on the government? You know, is it sort of, is it media? Is it having these things? Is it having open letters? Is it, I mean, to what extent do you think? Maybe Councillor Moemma's best place to answer that one.
No, that's okay. I guess the thing I would say is that we've, since the beginning, we've tried to be quite iterative in the way that some of this has developed. So we've tried, if somebody complains, go to the building, all those sorts of things. And we have taken an approach to lobbying, which was, some of it was very public facing, and try to invite people to join in that. Try to reach out to landlords in the borough, and starting from an educational perspective, a lot of people don't know that what they're doing is incorrect. So starting from that point, those people that refuse to receive that, then that's a slightly different tack. But I think the very depressing thing is that those people who are perhaps politically active or savvy are aware of an issue. Those people that are living in those conditions, they're aware of an issue, but they're also very fearful. There are things which have come out of some of the inspections that have happened, like, for example, inspections around, I wouldn't say trafficking is not the right word, I don't know what the word, but people that are working perhaps not completely legally, all those sorts of issues, hand to mouth, and people are, there is a wider issue of the portfolio, which we haven't really been able to touch on this term, which is around, that is what people can afford. And so people are really fearful, however bad the conditions are, it is what they can afford, they're therefore fearful of coming forward. And I think it would take a concerted effort to make the government see, and actually more importantly, civil servants, to see the real human impact of some of the issues that we deal with. We had one semi-successful visit from a former cabinet secretary, and that was the beginning of a conversation before Robert Jenrick took over, I would say, about conditions in London, but also here in Hackney. And I think having an evidence base is one thing, the human stories is really, really important. But ultimately, there is no regulatory framework for much of this to happen. It does require boots on the ground. So for everyone here who's a councillor will understand what it's like to go out and canvass and do how long it takes to speak to every household on a street. That is what the team do. It's not much more different to that. And so it is about having that evidence, and it's about making sure that we can defend residents and, where possible, encouraging people to come forward and to tell those stories. Because where you don't have people are worried about what the council will do or the housing association will do when they give those stories to the media. There is no protection for somebody in the private rented sector if they do that. They fear a revenge eviction, however much we can reassure them. So it's really overcoming some of that. And yeah, just I think getting the media interested in the plight of 30% of not just Hackney but the capital as well.
If I could just add to that, Councillor Joseph, you hit the nail on the head as well when you pointed that out about the politics behind this as well. It's not just a question of data. We do use the stories. We work positively. We've been positive throughout to show how it positively changes the place of not just Hackney but elsewhere. Sometimes you just get turned down despite that, and that's been a real problem. I saw Liverpool's submission. I do not know why that was turned down. I just don't know. All we can do is plug away. We'll carry on plugging away. It's part and parcel of a wider thing. You may recall Section 21 evictions. Councillor Member and Kevin will point out, we've been working on supporting the abolition of Section 21 since the Stone Age. Yeah. Remember Theresa May, it was going to abolish this about 3 or 4 years ago, which that abolition has sort of transmuted into a consultation about abolition. I don't know where it's gone at the moment. It's gone up into the dust and ether. We still lobby the government on a day-to-day basis. But that lobbying is really important around this stuff. It really, really is. We carry on, we do it. Your support's really welcome. And we'll carry on doing this as part of, if we do undertake a renewal of the licensing scheme, we will have to make those political points as well.
I've got Councillor Olsen as the last speaker.
Thanks, Chair. I can see the data in here. It says license issued 2,949. Application is being issued, license is being issued. Application received 5,818, and projected total licensable number is 8,667. So it says to me, my understanding is on this data, nearly 3,000 license issued, so that's okay for the standards, yes? And application received nearly 6,000, the nearly 2,000, the difference is about 2,000. Are they being refused or just on the review period? And the projected licensable properties, we've got the numbers. Why don't we prepare flyers which inform residents, tenants about the standards, about the complaint process, about the taking photos, about how can they raise that all those issues and to where, so we can prepare our website, our department accordingly to make things easier. By the time we give the flyers around in these properties, which is the numbers are there, which is great. So it also creates some pressure on landlord, also some knowledge for the tenants. And then if there is any, I mean, I don't know what's the civil penalty, exactly what civil penalty is. I would like to hear about that as well. And then just before the prosecution, of course, yeah, some landlords need notice of the prosecution, because if they don't comply the standards of the property before they rent it. And then, is there any compensation rights for the tenants, or can be done, can be provided some kind of compensation for the tenants if the standards are not okay to rent it? That's I'd like to, thank you.
Yes, Chair, if I may respond to that one. The shortfall between the number of applications and the number of licenses issued is down to the fact that for the higher risk properties, which is the HMOs and some other high to medium risks, we have said we will always inspect them prior to issuing the license. It's not a legal requirement to do so, but we have said that in order that we can actually raise standards in those properties at the front end of the process. So that's the shortfall there, because we couldn't inspect, we've held them back, and we've got a backlog. We are having a discussion as to whether we should issue some of those licenses where they're not extremely high risk, and then pick up the issues further down the line with inspections. That does cause us problems later on, because we can issue licenses with conditions that when we get to the property to inspect it are not quite right, and then we have to do a variation. So without getting into too much detail, that is a possibility. That is the reason why the license numbers issued is less than the number of applications, because of the inability for us to inspect. That was that one. As far as publicity for residents, tenants, we have done quite a lot on that. In the selective licensing area, we did a leaflet drop, a flyer drop through every door in those 3 wards. We're about to do another one this time, because when we did the first one, we didn't have the detailed data modeling on the subject properties. We do now have that, which we've done with our data insight team. So these will be more targeted to the properties which we believe should be licensed and are not. They will all receive a letter drop. So we are doing that, and we're about to do a wider comms campaign on licensing generally with our comms team in order to pick up areas outside of the selective licensing area. In terms of compensation for tenants, there are civil actions that tenants can take, but perhaps the best one that I can give you is rent repayment orders. If a tenant is living in if a property should be licensed and it's not so licensed, that's a criminal offence. But if we gather evidence that that is the case, the tenants can apply to a tribunal for what's called a rent repayment order. And that's where the tribunal will order the landlord, make an order for the landlord to refund the 12 months rent previous to the date of the offence. So it's a considerable amount of money. And we've been supporting tenants on that in various cases and have been very successful. And we are continuing to do that. So there are relatively straightforward recourse for tenants in that scenario. But there are other private civil action that they can take also, and there are agencies that will advise them on that.
So that would be great if we can make the tenants, they fully know their rights on this issue. That would be great, I guess. It would also create some pressure on landlords.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much for all the information. I think it's been an interesting update, and We will come up with some recommendations from this, I'm sure. I'd like to thank the members of the committee for taking part. And we now need to move on to the formal part of the business and look at the minutes of the meeting of the 8th of November. Can we agree the draft minutes of the 8th of November?
Agreed.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Item 7 is the work programme. We have 2 meetings left. The next meeting is a joint meeting with children and young people scrutiny to look at how the council provides accommodation for young people leaving care and what the offer is and how they live and where they live. And that should be extremely interesting. I think it's the first for us to have met with a joint meeting with children and young peoples. And our final meeting in the beginning of March is to look at the council's leisure facilities. And also we will be wrapping up our work on the council's zero net programme offer and how we're working towards that, and going to be drawing up a joint report with the other scrutiny commissions who have also been looking at their aspect of the council's work, so that can be taken forward to the cabinet with any recommendations and to full council. So with that, I'd like to, I have no other business being notified to me. With that, I'd like to close the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks all.
Thank you, Chair.
Much appreciated.